In this segment, the story of Abraham from the first book of the Bible, Genesis. It's important to understand that this story is considered by traditional Judaism to be history and not mythology. Is it history? We have to admit that much of this story cannot be independently verified. Of course, that's true of many events reported in ancient writings. It is true that many of the details in the book of Genesis have been confirmed by archaeology. They found ancient inscriptions, records of various kingdoms, and ruins that fit together hand in hand with this material. On some big topics, though, it is very much in dispute how accurate these biblical accounts are. How far back in history is this supposed to be? We can't be precise, but many scholars would guess around the year 1700 BCE. So we're way back in history, really kind of on the edge of recorded history. It's around then that Abraham is supposed to have emigrated to Canaan. In Genesis chapters 12 and 13, Abram and his wife Sarah leave the city of Haran, which is far to the east of modern Israel, to emigrate to Canaan, because God has told Abram that they should do this and has promised Abram that, quote, "I will make of you a great nation," end quote. When they arrive at Canaan, God tells Abram, "I will assign this land to your offspring," and this promise is reiterated. That promise occurs both in chapter 12 and chapter 13 of Genesis. At this time, Abraham is supposed to be about 75 years old. There is a famine in their area due to drought, and Abram and Sarai have to flee to Egypt, where there's a better food supply. There, Abram commits a sin by pretending that his wife is his sister. It's presented as a sin because he lacks faith in God's protection, and this causes some trouble. At this point, apparently both of them are old and past their childbearing years, and Abram expects to die childless. Still, in chapter 15, God promises him an heir, and even descendants as numerous as the stars. And it says, quote, "Because Abram put his trust in the Lord, he reckoned it to his merit," end quote. In other words, he obtained God's favor simply by trusting God. At Abram's request, God seals the deal in a covenant ceremony in which 4 animals are split in half. This was a way in Near East ancient culture to seal a solemn deal, a contract. They would split animals' bodies in half and then walk between them. The idea is that you're cursing yourself to their fate if you don't keep your end of the deal. Remarkably, God himself, just appearing in the form of an oven and a torch, invokes this self-curse. In other words, these things appear and travel through the split bodies. In this way, God obligates himself to keep the deal, to keep the covenant. Also in chapter 15, God predicts a 400-year exile of Abram's descendants in Egypt. He says that he's not ready to give them the land of Canaan yet, as, quote, "the iniquity of the Amorites," those are the people already living in Canaan, "is not yet complete," end quote. Abram now has in hand this divine promise of descendants. But now he takes matters into his own hands with unfortunate results. His wife Sarai comes up with a plan that Abram should sleep with her Egyptian slave named Hagar. Slavery, of course, was almost universally practiced in the ancient world, and apparently this was an ancient custom. Because the slave was a legal extension of the master, children born to the slave would legally belong to the master. So Sarai says, "Perhaps I shall have a son through her." So Hagar becomes Abram's concubine. At least that's how many translators put it. A concubine is kind of like a second-class wife. The man has exclusive sexual rights to her. She belongs to him, but she and her offspring do not necessarily have the same inheritance rights as a wife. Reluctantly, Abram agrees to this plan, and it works. Hagar, the slave, becomes pregnant. And because of this, she now looks down on her mistress Sarai. The reason is that barrenness in ancient times was considered a curse. The value of a woman largely consisted in her ability to produce new people. And if a woman couldn't do this, it was devastating to her self-esteem and to her place in society. Children, in contrast, were considered a sign of divine favor. So the slave girl who's become pregnant now looks down on her mistress, and Sarai can't deal with this. She demands that Abram pick between them, and he replies that Sarai owns Hagar, and so it's up to Sarai what happens to her. In chapter 16 of Genesis, Sarai mistreats Hagar and drives her off when she's still pregnant. But God is still merciful. Hagar is met by an angel of Yahweh who promises, quote, I will greatly increase your offspring, end quote. The angel tells her to go back. In chapter 16, it says that when she gives birth to her son Ishmael, Abraham is 86 years old. The text is a bit confusing because in chapter 17, there's another version of the story of God's promise to Abram, or is it supposed to be a reiteration of it? In chapter 17, Abram is 99, and God says that he'll be named Abraham, meaning father of a multitude. So he gets renamed. And Sarai gets renamed Sarah, which means princess. In chapter 17, El Shaddai, that is God Almighty, declares an everlasting covenant with Abraham's heirs, and says that the mark that they should bear is circumcision. And this, of course, is still done today. Specifically, it's his heirs through Sarah, which will be blessed. The boy that she will have is to be called Laughter, Isaac, because when God appears to Abraham and Sarah and says that they are going to have a baby, she laughed at that suggestion, because she was 89 and he was 99 at that point. God also says in chapter 17, though, that he will bless Ishmael, Abraham's son through Hagar, and will make him, quote, the father of 12 chieftains and, quote, a great nation, end quote. In Genesis 21 and 22, Sarah has her baby, miraculously, and sometime later she demands that that slave woman and her son be kicked out. This distresses Abraham, but God tells Abraham to go ahead and comply. Hagar then gets kicked out with her son. In despair, she's running out of water in the desert, and an angel comes to her rescue and shows them a well. Now, one gets the impression in chapter 21 that Ishmael is a baby or a toddler. Yet according to chapters 16 and 17, in chapter 21, would have to be at least 15, if not older. This has led many critics to infer that the sending away of Hagar and her son in chapter 21 is a more developed version of the story found back in chapter 16. This brings us to the documentary hypothesis. Here it is as held by the recent writer Richard Friedman in his book Who Wrote the Bible. The theory is that there are 4 principal sources of the Torah, which are distinguished by different style and different vocabulary and different theology. One they call the Yahwist, because this writer calls God Yahweh, the proper name. Another's called the Elohist, because this one calls God Elohim, which is the generic term for God or gods in Hebrew. And then there's considered to be a later priestly source and a redactor, somebody editing the material a little bit later on in history. This type of theory was hatched first by German scholars in the 19th century, and it's fairly widely accepted, at least on the less conservative wing of biblical scholarship. One can always resist this, of course, because it's an uncertain business speculating about different authors just based purely on style and vocabulary. So some more conservative scholars would say that chapter 21 isn't a later version of the story in chapter 16. Rather, those were really 2 incidents. They were 2 somewhat different incidents. That is, Hagar was sent away twice, once when pregnant and once with a young son. In any case, Hagar and Ishmael thrive. They're last seen in the Bible in Genesis 21, but we'll see them again later on in this course. Another famous incident occurs in Genesis 22. It's called the Akkada, or the binding. This is a climactic test of Abraham's faith. It says that God put Abraham to the test and ordered him to make a burnt offering of his son Isaac, the son who miraculously, after God's prediction, has been born to him and his wife in their old age. The very son through which God is going to make a great nation. In obedience to God, Abraham takes Isaac and travels 3 days to the designated place, and it seems like he's going to go through with it. He ties Isaac up, puts him on a stone altar that they've just built, and raises up the knife and is about to plunge it into Isaac to kill him in the way that one would offer normally, say, a goat or a sheep. But before he sticks the knife in, he's stopped by an angel sent by God. This angel, speaking for God, says, quote, "Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me," end quote. And at that moment, Abraham sees a wild ram caught in a bush. So he unties his son, and they sacrifice that wild ram instead. And in response, God reiterates his promised blessings. He says, quote, "And through your descendants all the nations of the earth will be blessed. all because you have obeyed me. In our next and final segment of this lecture, the stories of Joseph, Moses, and the Ten Commandments.